Beetz with All Car News, and we have Andrew here from the Current Review. And today we have our guest Troy. How are you doing today, Troy?
Doing awesome. It's nice seeing you
Awesome.
guys. Nice seeing
And
you,
Mr.
Andrew,
Troy
again.
Beetz, likewise. And Mr. Troy Beetz, you have an extensive history in the automotive industry. So can you kind of like just go about some of the pivotal points in your history in the automotive industry from Karma Automotive, DeLorean, Lexus? I mean, there's just so much to talk about. So if you could give us a little spark notes of some very interesting things in your career and we could discuss them.
Yeah. So like you said, I've worked for Toyota, Lexus. I used to work for Neo, who at the time was Next EV. They were in their Skunk Works phase when I was in there in Silicon Valley, 2015. Then went to Karma Automotive, who you guys know very well, and then had an opportunity to go over to DeLorean as a founder and owner to help set up that company up from a 40-year gap in history. And then started my podcast, which was How Strong. It was basically interviewing a lot of people in the startup space who were in the automotive space. I got a lot of good friends who are in the EV motorcycle space, which I thought was going to go away, but it's actually ramping up quite a bit now. I've got a few of those guys at CES this week showcasing their vehicles. And yeah, it's been a whirlwind working with the automotive side and the EV side. I mean, it's been a huge overhaul of the industry to see EV, and I see a ton of stuff that you're doing on that EV sector. Quite critical of Tesla. I do see you say you have some really good accolades for them as well, but yeah, I think it's all really exciting. I actually wanted to get your take on CES. So, because a long time ago, the auto show industry for us, when you talk about pivotal moments, some of those pivotal moments are concept vehicles. Like every year we're expecting to see this new vision of automotive and what it's going to look like. And concept cars used to be really, really the show attraction. And now we're seeing fewer and fewer of them. And LA Auto Show has been not what it used to be in years past. I'm not sure for people who are listening, but auto shows back in the day, and when I say back in the day, I mean mid 2000s, it was a huge show. I mean, you used to have press days, you used to have gala events before the auto show started, black tie.
Wow.
You got to meet everybody in the industry, and it was a really special occasion to come on those press days or go to the galas that would happen prior to the auto shows. And that seems to have gone away. Detroit was one of those things that went away. I think that was one of those things you wanted to go to, and then after a while that went. And now we're at CES, which is sort of like this next auto show.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it definitely seems like there's much fewer concepts being shown at these big auto shows, but it almost, from how I see it, it's almost like a lot of automakers are kind of releasing vehicles on their own. Like, especially like we can use Karma Automotive when they unveiled their all new lineup. They didn't do it at any auto show. They just did it on their own, showing off several pretty cool new vehicles. But yeah, it's almost, I guess I'll push that question back to you. Do you think the automotive culture is kind of dying in a way?
I think the romance is for sure. I think in the automotive side, these concept vehicles, and it's going to come back to electrification, I think, too, because a lot of the vehicles that you would see concept-wise weren't EV. And when you're an EV vehicle, there are certain things that must be true to get certain mileage that you need. The fantastical designs of a few years ago don't work because those aren't EVs; those were gas engines. And I think the other one too is I think it's getting hyper competitive. I think auto shows, you're only significant during the time you're showcasing your vehicle, and then you move on to the next one that gets launched. I did mine at Pebble Beach for DeLorean. I did that on purpose, but it was Pebble Beach is a really good car culture event. There's a rich history of cars at Pebble Beach, but I think for the auto shows, yeah, I think it's dying. And I think you lose your brand at the auto shows too, because there's only so much you can do inside a booth that you could do if you built out a space in some other location that was completely branded your car company. And I think that's one of the things that's happening now. And I think that's what Karma did. Karma decided to showcase its brand new vehicle on its own terms in its own unique place. And I think that was a good idea.
Hmm. Interesting. And I think that's also just a different point. Like we can look at companies like Tesla, and they don't need any automotive show to get hype. I mean, the Tesla Model 3 Highland refresh just got leaked a few hours before, and it was like a
Yep.
Wednesday night at maybe like 6 or 7 o'clock everywhere. And you just don't really get that sort of hype anymore with other manufacturers. So it's like these big names, especially in electrification, just kind of take the center stage.
Yeah, and I think Tesla changed a lot of that. I think the story, or at least the myth, is they spend no money on marketing. They do, but not to the extent, not nearly the extent that OEMs have to do it today. And you've got someone like Elon, who is a brand in itself. I mean, a lot of people associate Tesla with Elon because he is the brand.
Hmm.
He's someone that brings a lot of attention. So when Tesla does something like that, really interesting. I think every other OEM would love to have the impact Tesla has on product launches, but that's a special breed of car company for sure.
Definitely. And so I think kind of going back to positions in your career, like especially at DeLorean. So you had a brand that people are generally familiar with, but especially when you're trying to revive it. So like, what were kind of the struggles of bringing this vehicle out to market and generating some hype behind it?
The biggest impact was probably the storytelling of what we were trying to do, which was we weren't trying to bring back the DMC-12. We were trying to bring back DeLorean as an OEM. And
Hmm.
if you're in the OEM world, you understand that that's a big task to do, because if we're building a brand new OEM, that's difficult enough because you don't have a history. And then you're bringing back DeLorean, which has a history, but more of a history with the DMC-12 than as the DeLorean brand. So, what we try to do is build up a product line. The Alpha 5 was the first product line after a 40-year gap in history. And the biggest challenge was really not building a DMC-12. That would have been the easiest thing to do. But that
Hmm.
would have been the most difficult too, because half of the people would have loved it and half of them would have hated it, whatever we built.
Hmm.
And I think overcoming and sticking to our guns and saying, hey, we're trying to build an OEM, not the DMC-12. I think that was a challenge, because we had a lot of people on social media who only wanted the Back to the Future car.
Hmm.
And God, if you just look at the history of the DMC-12 and the wedge design, um, that goes back to the 1960s. There were automotive companies doing that same web design. And it was interesting then, but when you're not a fan of history on the automotive side, and you have to please a population that is in love with Back to the Future, that they create a lot of noise. And then when the Alpha 5 came out, it was a beautiful car. It wasn't the DMC-12, but it wasn't supposed to be. So that was the
Hmm.
other thing, is just sort of defending the art of design too, because the easy thing to do would be to duplicate the DMC-12, but how much thought goes into doing that?
Hmm.
It's not sustainable. We'd never be able to sell enough to build a company around. You have to foundationally build a strong OEM first. And that was sort of the more complicated thing, was trying to educate the consumer. This is why we're doing what we're doing.
Hmm. Yeah, because I feel like just anyone in their garage could kind of bring back DeLorean as an electric company, because you could just have the same body. You could just find a way to put EV components in there, and it could be kind of cobbled together, but that would get the job done if you just want to electrify a DMC-12. But if you want to rebuild a company, I agree, it's a totally different route.
Yeah, and building a new company these days is not like building GM over 100 years ago. There are some people out there who build battery packs. There are companies out there, you can basically build a car with all the components you need and not need to build all those components yourself.
Hmm.
And I think that's where these new sort of new car companies are at right now, which is you don't need to invest billions of dollars in engineering when you can outsource engineering, you can outsource contract manufacturing now. So that's interesting.
Yeah, because Justin, we were recently talking about Fisker and its contract and manufacturing. So do you want to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even just Fisker. I think now another fantastic example I was just able to drive was the Ineos Grenadier, which
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have prospects of maybe going electric or hydrogen down the road, but I mean, they're doing well for themselves now. But they have a BMW engine, they have a ZF gearbox. You know, they're kind of picking a lot of these fantastic parts in the industry now and kind of piecing it together, contracting out some of the manufacturing, not the manufacturing, but a lot of the engineering with Magna, I believe. So, which is a fantastic company, but you're right in the sense that like a lot of these newer manufacturers, startups are able to kind of build upon what's great and existing already and kind of build a decently good vehicle at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you do contract and manufacturing, and Troy, since you've been in the industry so long, so how much stability do you think there is with having a company based solely on the business premise of being a contract and manufacturer?
Well, I mean, you look at, I mean, Mercedes-Benz does contract manufacturing. They utilize contract manufacturing. So does BMW, so does Porsche.
Yes.
I
Like the
think
Jaguar I-Pace, the several I think the BMW 5 Series is one of them. That's made by Magna.
Yeah, so Magna's fantastic, and I wouldn't say anything about Magna specifically, but if you're a new car company with no history and you're going into a large contract manufacturing facility, there's still something called like the A team, B team, and C team, depending on where you go. If you're a brand new startup, are you going to get that same attention hypothetically that you're going to get if you're BMW or Porsche? Probably not. And that's where quality comes in. And then you have to understand too, you're going to have to then start transporting those vehicles and transporting those vehicles from the contract manufacturer to somewhere globally. There's a lot that happens in between the build and then when it arrives. And it's just a little bit more difficult to get a big contract manufacturer to look at a startup and go, we're going to give you the same amount of engineering focus we're going to give Porsche or BMW. There's a reason why every 911 that comes out, and they don't contract manufacture that, but the 911, if you ever go to a dealership and look at a 911, as many as they build every year, the tolerances they have on that car is spectacular. I mean, that car is built very, very well for being mass produced. And that's the tolerance from, Volkswagen and the Porsche group or the VW group. But I think contract manufacturing is fantastic. A lot of companies don't want to invest in building factories, building the tooling. When you have a contract manufacturer that can do that for very large companies and produce a lot of vehicles, that's probably the easiest way to go. There's really no reason for a new car company to want to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we kind of see. Sorry, we're gonna say.
No, I was just going to say, especially in California. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine building a brand new factory in California and you have a paint booth. It takes a long time to get certified to paint a vehicle in California in a brand new factory. That's why you see them going outside of California. But yeah, what were you going to say?
Awesome. Yeah, I was just gonna mention that. Like, I mean, we're seeing a lot of the, not necessarily with startups, but a lot of OEMs now are kind of partnering up and kind of working on vehicles together or kind of sharing platforms. Even with Honda and Acura and now GM, with their two new BEVs coming out. So I think that's an interesting trend kind of going forward. What do you kind of see that and that kind of like a relationship, not necessarily with contract manufacturing, but this kind of sharing of platforms and stuff?
Yes, it's not new. I mean, Toyota was doing that with Subaru a long time ago. I mean, even back in the early days, Toyota was sharing a plant with GM in Northern California. So that kind of stuff goes on. I see no issues with it. The issue I have, this just from a personal perspective, is when the cars come out and they're exactly the same, they're just badged differently. You can see that with what was the Scion and the Subaru. Those two vehicles that came out were
FRS and BRZ.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty close.
Yeah.
And it's pretty close. And that's what I didn't want to see, which is the sharing of the platform, and then some of the other body shapes that come around. They basically look exactly the same.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting because we see so many examples of that, especially now. So we have Subaru Solterra, Toyota BZ4X, and the most recent one, and you've actually driven both of them, Justin, the Dodge Hornet and the Alfa Romeo Tonale. And these
Mhm.
cars, like, you can, like, from the side profile, they're virtually the same. And we're kind of losing some of that, like, personality that makes, because it's like, especially if you're like comparing a Subaru Solterra to a BZ4X, it's like, if you're comparing them, they're the exact same. It's which one do you want? Do you want the cheaper one or the more expensive one? So that, yeah, that's um, definitely getting very close.
Yeah, so I think the separation of vehicles, but I think the EV as a segment as a whole is starting to look very similar. There's only so much you can do when you're guaranteeing minimum of 300-mile range. And I think that's probably, and I did something a long time ago. It was a podcast I had done, but also just um, another program I was working in called Art Over Arrow, which is really talking to designers about what that looks like in terms of staying focused on design and staying true to design, and not necessarily it all being about aero and efficiency.
Mhm.
And when you look at the EVs now, it really is about efficiency. It really is about lightweighting. And I think once you do that, the flexibility to design what you want to design goes away. Um, and it's just, and it's a romance that I talked to some designers about, and it really is just my own. If you're a car guy outside the industry, you have a romance with design. Um, Much like you guys have seen the process of claying the car.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that part of design. I love going
Yeah.
in, and it's interesting when you see the designers and they're shaving off just the minute amount of clay. And but for that purpose, that's exactly what needed to come off. And to them, it means a lot because that's their eye, and they're slowly going away from doing that. There's technology where you don't have to clay a car anymore, and that's the piece where when that goes away, everything else is done through CAD. Um,
Mhm.
if you want a certain coefficient of drag, you have your CAD in there. All you do is say, I'd like to have 0.22, and then the system creates what that would take on this vehicle without having to clay it. And I think that's where the industry is going. And again, just saying that that's another reason why there aren't these concept cars. They're really expensive.
Mhm.
Most of these car companies already have a solid brand. And is there a need to go out and do concept vehicles that cost a lot of money to do?
How much are they
Uh,
normally? Like, I've heard like estimates from 1 to like 20 million.
oh yeah. You could get away with doing a concept vehicle if you're borrowing a chassis. Um, I'd say 800,000 you could probably do, but that's just exterior. That's not interior.
Wow.
And then you get up to show car quality, which is about a year away from production, and you're still looking. Some of the more expensive ones, like 20 million, sure. Um,
That's insane.
but just the
But
car
yeah,
companies have to decide they want to do that, and it's not necessary anymore.
I don't think people really take for granted how much time and emphasis and expenses gets put into these vehicles.
Yeah,
It's insane.
yeah, and they're all, I mean, for the most part, all one-offs. I mean, when you have a concept car, you hope to have two. Um, Typically, you have one, and that travels around. It gets broken. I could tell you that when we moved the Alpha 5 from Italy to California to go to Pebble Beach, man, you're holding your breath the entire time because it's flown over, it's
Wow.
crated, it's decrated once it gets to the hangar, and this, I couldn't tell you how many layers and layers of protective coating is there, and you're just hoping nothing's wrong. I've had plenty of concept vehicles come over where they're painted in Japan, they get flown over within 24 hours, and you take the tape off and the paint is wasn't cured, so the paint came off.
Wow.
And there is no paint code because the car's it's a concept vehicle, and the new paint code only comes once it's actually certified. So then you have to have a paint. You have to have a can of paint with that car to make sure that if it does get scratched or needs to be repainted, you can paint it. It's painful. And then showing the cars, I can't tell you how many times someone bumped a mirror off. But fortunately, on these concept vehicles, what a lot of people don't know is the side mirrors are magnets for that same reason. If someone bumps into a side mirror and it falls off, it's not because it's broken, it's because it was a magnet. Because we anticipate, of course, someone bumping in it, but we also do it for load testing to make sure it can fit in a crate. But yeah, it's expensive. Would like to see more of them doing that.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely for sure. I mean, I guess just to kind of like speak on that, I just was with the Lucid Gravity prototype concept thing over here in Manhattan. And I mean, we had like 6 of us in a room with it, and they still had everyone around it opening the doors for you very carefully. And it's not a fully functioning vehicle yet, but it's just they have like 2 or 3 of them. And I'm sure they're taking very high security and high care of all the work they put into that.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because when you said opening up the doors for you, I'll just go back to DeLorean really quick because there's a plan you have, like that's perfect, and this is how you want the event to go. And then there is this plan B that happens when you don't expect something to happen. So when we were at, we had the great privilege of bringing the Alpha 5 to Pebble and then putting it on the display stand, the winner's stand. And the idea was that we would drive the vehicle on the winner's stand, and then we would allow people to come in, all the press, to take pictures of it. And what ended up happening was the Alpha 5 couldn't fit into the trailer by the hangar, which is bizarre because it got there in a trailer, but couldn't leave in a trailer after we put the car together. And the car was late. And they said, there's no way. It was late enough where the crowd actually started coming. And then the only option we had was to drive the vehicle it's about 200 yards away on the grass, uphill, wet grass. And the reason why I think this is funny is because when the doors open up, because it's a prototype, it's not going to be this amazing sort of extension of the door. There may be a creak in there. And you don't want to have the car drive up. Everybody's quiet because the doors are then opening, and then you hear this creak. So what ended up happening was it was late. The crowd was there. The car drove up the grass. The other reason you don't want that to happen is because if it slips or it can't make it up the hill, it slides. It's a heavy car. There's about 200 yards of just, you have no idea what's going to happen. And then fortunately, it got up the grass, went onto the stand. I had some of the producers turn the music up loudly at the event so that when the doors opened, you couldn't hear any creaks. But to the consumer, to everybody there, it was magnificent. It was the best entry they've ever seen. But in the background, you're like, oh, this is not how it was supposed to go. Because it had a remote too, because we have to remote open the doors, lights. There was only 2 of those remotes. One of them actually broke. And then we were down to 1 other remote. And then the more stressful thing is that we were filming Fast X 3 days after Pebble. So the car that left Pebble had to go get trailer down to Hollywood to be in Fast 10 and then wrapped. And you're like, okay, this is enough pressure because we have Pebble. Now we got to get this car down to LA to film in Fast 10, to film in 3 days, and then the car gets shipped out again. So anytime you see a car show, at least with an expensive concept car, man, there's so much stuff that goes on to make sure that car gets there, is prepped. And there's a lot of nervous people when those cars arrive. You just don't see it, but everyone is sweating on the other end to make sure nothing happens.
Wow. So there was another concept that DeLorean showcased, and I believe it was the Omega, the SUV. Okay, can you tell me about that? Because that just looks insane. Like, I have never seen a vehicle that looks, I think it's really cool. I'll put a picture of it up post-editing.
Yeah, so this is going to take a while. It won't take a while, but I'll just paraphrase. Again, for us to bring DeLorean back, we wanted to fill in the 40 years of history with history that could have happened had DeLorean stayed.
Mhm.
So we had several prototypes there of certain eras, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and we filled in this void of where DeLorean would have been had they stayed. And then the idea was, well, to show longevity, especially for a company like us, why don't we show what the next generation of design theme would look like in 2040? So Omega was that vehicle that we would have released in 2040 to show the next 30 years of vehicle design, or at least directionally where we thought design was going to go. And we came up with Omega, and that was going to be, so, you see Alpha 5, right? But
Mhm.
what's the next generation of vehicle design after Alpha 5? And that's where Omega came in, which was our foundation for the future. So anything coming after Alpha 5 would have similar lines to Omega, at least directionally how that would look. So we wanted to show the past, the present, and then a peek at where DeLorean thought design would go, in the next 20 years. And that's where Omega came in. And it was, just so you know, on our side, anytime you do a design like that, if you have Omega, you probably have 6 to 10 other vehicles that you're choosing from that look similar to Omega. So when we worked with Ital Design, a lot of other designers were trying to build or at least design something that looked like Omega, and then we picked this one. But there wasn't a bad version of 2040, and Omega was. I remember. So all of these vehicles come in big wooden crates. They're crated in Italy. They come over, and once they started taking Omega apart, it's just amazing to see this thing in person when you unbox it. It's the most amazing. It's one of the most amazing experience I've ever had. If you want to talk about like pivotal moments, it's not Omega, but it was definitely the Alpha 5, because when the Alpha 5 came over, it's this big box crate. It's got this tiny, it's probably got a 2-foot window. And beyond the window is the vehicle inside, but it's got layers and layers of protective cloth on it. And all you can do is put your hand on the inside, and you can feel every shape of the hood and the fender and the tire. But in your mind, it's almost hyper focused because it's what you saw on paper. And then putting your hand in this box and feeling it, it was a profound experience because you remember where that line was by hand, and you can follow the form of the vehicle, and it's hypersensitive when you're not using your eyes, and every touch was magnified by that. And that's why we came up with, and this goes back to concepts again, which was we want to have a visceral experience with the vehicle. And in 2000, and I'm sure you guys have done this too, you guys were all car people. In 2014, Mercedes came out with a Vision GT car, and it was a silver car. And I remember going to the auto show, and I was completely just in awe of the shape, and I couldn't take it all in. And cars don't do that today. I was literally at the auto show, and then 2 seconds later, my hand was on the car, and I didn't know where I was between where I saw it and then where my hand was on the car. And there's something about that connection between form and that shape, and you have to touch it. And that's one of the biggest experiences. You're not going to get that with a Tesla. You're not going to get that with what's coming out now. There isn't anything that draws you to want to touch a car anymore. And that might be how it works. I'm not sure if that's the future. I mean, you guys are that next generation. I don't know if you guys see the same value in form that someone like me does.
Yeah.
That's one of my biggest things that I always am talking about all the time. That's why I appreciate Mazda, for example. They have they're really true in depth with their photo design language. I'm a huge supporter of the brand. Always talking about them. And I'm gonna break this out because I have it sitting right next to me. But I myself will make models out of clay, like cars and things, and I did it all by hand. It's just like I appreciate the forms and the stuff and the design of the cars. And I try to my best to make people see it, but they just are blindsided by, I think, today with all the technology. Does it have AI or TikTok on the screen or something? But yeah.
Yeah, and that's the scary thing too, is the idea that when we talked about building vehicles, um, is there a need for the car to drive itself? Is there a need to have it even, it could just be a pod at some point. It doesn't actually need to be a vehicle anymore. It could just be a way to transport one person from A to B. But for people who are in the car business and like design, it's why everybody kids buy Hot Wheels and models, and they want to put them together. And I have a good friend of mine who runs the design over at Mattel. And the scary thing is that if we start losing that, what's a Hot Wheel going to look like? What's a little kid going to do when they see the vehicle and not want to be a designer? Do they want to go to design school to build perfect, round, efficient shapes so that you get 600 miles to the charge? Motor Trend. What are you going to put on Motor Trend or Road and Track? That's where this whole it's an art form, and I think that's what worries me, is that it's going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, on the basis of Tesla, it's like I have nothing but respect for what Tesla has done, just with everything business wise. But when it comes to the designs, they're just very aerodynamic, and obviously aerodynamics is a huge factor of an EV. About 62% of your range is, or 62% of the energy in your battery is just going to be used pushing away the air. So you really need a very efficient design to minimize that. But when you just have, the Tesla Model Y, which is an amazing vehicle in so many areas, but it's just bland when you look at it. And you got 5 different colors, a few different wheel options. You're talking like 20 different combinations of Teslas you can see on the road stock, versus like, I don't know, maybe say Porsche wouldn't be a great example because they're a lot more expensive, but like the BMW i4, it's like you have so much more customization when you're building this vehicle. And I think the thing is with Tesla, it's like you have a okay design, it's very aerodynamic, but it's just not great looking. And then you just have a few colors, and it's like, this definitely feels like more of a, I don't know, an appliance rather than something you're very proud of.
Yeah, it's funny you say that too, because if you look at Tesla in 2012, 13, and 14, they had much more options in terms of exterior paint,
Yes, they
wheels.
had like green, brown, bunch of other colors.
Yeah, and it's when you start understanding the product planning side of, okay, we have this car, but then there's a huge expense to wheel design. There's a huge expense to it, especially when you're trying to build the vehicles and the combinations that come out. Reducing the amount of colors and options helps Tesla save money,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand why they're doing that. The other one is just design philosophy. I worked for an OEM, and I've worked for many, so they're not going to know which one. But the Tesla design isn't meant for the first customer. It's meant for the second or third customer. So imagine getting a used Tesla. You can do it today. Unless you're really good about understanding the nose of that vehicle, you don't know what year that vehicle's from. And the interior is pretty much agnostic on time as well. So if you're the second or third owner and you're in a Tesla, nothing drastically has changed enough that it's dated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what helps OEMs when they don't have to constantly, like if Tesla designs something that dated in 3 years and no one wants that design, then they're in trouble. But Tesla does a really good job of making sure their vehicles don't date as quickly. And I think that's what's nice about Tesla, is that for any customer, the first, second, or third buyer, no one knows what year your vehicle is in. So it's got good resale. Although I did see something that you wrote about residuals on Tesla. So that whole residual piece too on Tesla is interesting, because especially if it's a brand new product and you don't have a residual, you'll get one, but it might not be what you expect.
Mm-hmm.
And when you put a lease together through an OEM, you don't have to use the residual that's out there. You can put your own residual that you want out there to make the lease payment what it is. That doesn't mean that residual translates into a residual 3 years from now, because then it'll change again. So if you have a higher residual because you've manipulated it to get to a lease payment, by the time the auction comes around, the true residual will have already been established by then. So the whole residual piece in leasing is really interesting. I saw Fisker's too. A long time ago, Fisker put out a lease payment on the Ocean Air.
I think it was like 379.
Yeah, and I had no idea how they did that without understanding what the residual was going to be, or even guaranteeing a lease price at that point. But
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing with Tesla prices now, because I recently bought a used Model 3 kind of over the summer, so I paid a little bit more because the market went down, but I still was on the lower end. But still, its price is depreciated. But the thing is, like now, it's like, who's gonna buy a used Model 3 for like 25, which is about what the going rate is for, with like relatively not crazy miles, like 25, 30. But right now you can get a new one, like for a lease for like 300 a month. And if you're like talking like payments, it's like the lease is just gonna make a lot more sense for a lot of people. So
yeah,
I think that definitely does bring a good question. What's going to happen with, and especially with just the influx of Teslas on the road, how many new ones are selling? What's going to happen to used Tesla prices? I mean, this thing is, it's like they're still in high demand, but there's just so many of them just getting pumped out of the factory. So I think that brings up a question: is how much are they going to be going for, like in 2 to 3 years from now?
yeah, and I think that's going to be, there's a saturation point at some point too. And then you've got the competition coming in for Tesla as well.
Mhm.
Their brand is just so strong that I think whatever they do, I used to think a long time ago when Tesla came out that if BMW ever wanted to turn that switch and be all EV, they could. Um, but then you realize globally what that means for their production. Some regions, China, Europe, and the US, they're not all on that same EV trend. I mean, they're definitely trending up, but some are moving faster than others. And, some countries are hybrid. They love the fact that there's a hybrid variant versus a pure EV. And, Tesla's lucky because they don't have any other variants other than EV. So you have to get, in Europe, China, or the US, that's just what it is. But if you're BMW and you're in China, it's probably better to have an ICE variant of that vehicle in China versus just saying we're all EV. But yeah, they're a monster.
I would question whether the industry would be going that way, like with Mach-E, EV6, all these other cars, if Tesla ceased to exist. That's what I'd say.
Well, I mean, you already have sort of a history with BMW on that, the i3
Mhm.
and the i8.
Yeah,
Yep.
the i3, I love the i3, and I drove like some early ones. Very impressive car, but um I would be interested in seeing BMW's strategy if Tesla didn't exist. I think that would be interesting to see how they would have continued their electrification plans.
Really hard, probably, because they would have had to. I mean, who's built? They're not. No one's building a gigafactory. Um, and maybe that would have come from China. Maybe that push would have come. I don't know how BYD, how long they've been around. I know they've been around as a company for a very long time.
Mhm. But they
But
never were doing anything crazy up until recently. Because I remember like in like 2012, they were on CNBC or something, and they were like showing their vehicles, and it was just like the
Yeah.
most boring looking vehicle ever made. But now they're making really cool stuff. So
yeah, I
yeah.
drove their vehicles.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, um,
Recently?
a year ago.
Okay.
I
So like
I
the
think
newer ones.
oh yeah, the newer ones. I was really surprised. Stella Lee's the president of BYD in the US. I met with her, drove in those vehicles. You know what? They are, and I've worked for Lexus. Those cars are Lexus quality.
Wow.
I was really surprised at how well they were put together and the way they drove and the voice control on the inside, which was really interesting because it's in Mandarin. And, you know, Mandarin is a very difficult language to understand. The car understood the nuances of Mandarin to open the sunroof, close the sunroof, open the windows, close it. There was no glitch at all. And the second you said it, it happened. It was really well done. The cars were really well made. And I was really surprised. I mean, competitively, if those cars came over to the US, there would be a lot of issues with some of these car companies if the quality could be where it was at that I saw. Really well done, really well made, drove really well. But, you know, is the US ready for a 100% China-made EV? I'd hope so, but I'm not sure.
Yes, that would be very interesting to find that consumer sentiment on it, because we have some now, like the Polestar 2, and then soon to be the Volvo EX30, but we have an actual Chinese brand. I guess Polestar is based in Sweden, but it is owned in part by Geely. But if we have a pure Chinese brand, I would be very interested in seeing the consumer sentiment on just if people would be rushing out to buy Chinese EVs, because I'm sure there is definitely be a little bit of a pushback with certain demographics of buyers.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because when I was with Toyota, on one side you have customers who wouldn't buy a Japanese vehicle, and on the other end you had people checking the VIN on the camera to make sure the vehicle was built in Japan because it had better quality. And they're like, I only want to buy a vehicle only if the VIN has a J in it. And we had Camrys built in the US, but customers knew that, at least in their own mind, that getting the vehicle built in Japan was a better quality vehicle. And then when Tundra, oh man, I mean, tell you stories about Camry going into Indy 500. And I was working in the Midwest at that time. Imagine launching a vehicle in NASCAR, and it's Camry, and there was a revolt of having that vehicle in there. It was difficult to push a narrative where Camry was going to be in NASCAR, and that kind of showed you where the sentiment was on having what was perceived a Japanese-made car go into NASCAR. And it was an ugly thing to see, because the Camrys were built in the U.S. I worked for the U.S. company. There's a lot of really good people working for Toyota in factories in the U.S. Just not welcoming that car at all. Tundra was the same way. Tundra is built in Texas. You know, how many people thought that the car was built in Japan? And like, they built a whole factory in Texas to build this vehicle, and just because it said Toyota on it, it didn't resonate that car could even be in the U.S. But so going back to a Chinese company, I think it's sort of like you say, there's some cars made in China that are here, and they do really well. But having a complete Chinese company in the U.S. importing from China, I don't know if that would work.
And with the tariffs as well, right now, it would just be not very financially advantageous.
Well, there's a whole political system. I mean, if anything goes wrong in China, cars don't come, parts don't come, ships don't come, and that's a huge risk. But the quality, from what I saw from BYD, was remarkable. So they can at least build a very good quality vehicle.
So when you mentioned the BYD quality, so you did work partly under NIO for a little bit. So were you able to experience those vehicles, and do you have some insight on that?
Yeah, NIO was interesting because NIO, it was definitely a startup, but it definitely did its research on who the customer was and what they needed. Lucid is exactly Lucid's primary, at least internally, for the product they were trying to compete with was the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. They wanted to create the same type of scenario and product where it was about luxury and it was about safety and attention to detail. And they definitely did their work on who the S-Class customer was. NIO was the same way. A ton of research on who the customer was, how they use the vehicle, what they wanted in the vehicle. It was probably one of the most complicated programs in terms of research that I've ever been a part of. They definitely researched every component of that vehicle to make sure that it was going to come out and be competitive. That was 100% true, especially with quality. Especially, what was really interesting is they were coming up with the idea of these customer centers in China. They spent an equal amount of building that part of the go-to-market strategy along with how they were building this vehicle. So instead of building a vehicle out and then saying, how do we go to market with it? The go-to-market strategy was almost prepared in parallel with the vehicle. So they were already putting in place that we were gonna, they were gonna build these vehicles, have customer centers, experience the brand. They did ride-in drives in China. Really, really well done to make sure that that car took off. That was the ES8 at the time. But then you had the EP9, which was, it was probably one of the most beautiful cars that I've seen. And then it was at Nürburgring, spy photos, and it was nice to see that they were using performance, and then they were in Formula E, and then they came out with this car. So they were building this brand strategy and this narrative really organically. So when the car came out, it already had a pretty good history within Nürburgring with Formula E performance. It had some amazing drivers at the time. And it won, I think, in its second year of Formula E, the Neo car. So it had this really good background. And then, you look at BYD, which is, huge in China. I think it's the number one. I think it just outsold Tesla in China. Mm-hmm. Was the number one EV in China, and they make EV buses here in California. But what I wasn't expecting was the quality. So when I look at quality, if you ever do this and you do a walk around, every time I go to a new car, I reach under the wheel well to see if I feel felt or plastic liners, or sometimes there's nothing, which is awful. But I always check for the wheel well. I check to see if there's felt in there, because it's just a good sign for me to think that they've researched enough to know that they need to put felt in the wheel well. I open the trunk and take the mats out, the carpet, and look for wax seam sealer. Wax seam sealer, for every weld that's in there, they'll, most OEMs, good ones, put wax seam sealer over every weld to take moisture out of them. A long time ago, I used to look at a lot of the domestics. If you look at the bottom of your door, there would be a V channel on the bottom of your door to collect the water, and it would run through. In most of the imports would close the stamp and they wouldn't put a V. And the drainage would go on the inside. And if you ever looked at old domestic cars, were you in the Midwest at all?
I'm there occasionally because my dad's.
All right, so a long time ago, like if you looked at a Ford, for instance, you would see rust on the bottom of the door. They had an open channel, and over time, rust would get in there, expansion, and I always check the welds to make sure they're closed. If you look at the door, on the inside door jamb, you'll see a wax seam sealer over your weld, the stamp on the door on the inside. It's rubbery. You can put your fingernail in it. You can feel that that's the wax seam sealer. I look for that everywhere on the car, but that's the kind of detail that that BYD did. I did a walk around and checked the welds and the wheel well, the carpeting, and the glass, which was amazing too. It's double glassed. Every time I get into a car, I feel the top of the window glass, and you can feel two panes. It's in there. It's just every detail was everything that I would look for was there. And that's what it's going to take. And I think most car companies do that. The one thing that bothers me the most, though, and this is just from being in the business a long time, and Tesla just does this to me, but I know there's tolerances for them. Anytime the body panels don't match up. If you look at the Model X or Model S and you see the DLO, which is the chrome around the vehicle, you can see that it's off just a little bit on the B column or the B pillar. And I think they have a 3 millimeter tolerance for error. Body gaps, I cannot stand, because there's so much that goes on with a body gap. One is just bad engineering, or it's bad manufacturing, which means there's bad numbers. There shouldn't be a body gap like that. And when you look at a Porsche, man, the 911, here's what other people do too, is a lot of car companies, especially the glass, not the glass, but the headlights and the casing around the headlight. You'll see a rubber gasket in between the lamp and the body panels. And that's I mean, it's good to have, but it also covers up a lot of body alignment. So anytime you see, I've had some cars where you can actually see inside the hood through the line. You can see the battery on the inside, and it's just insane. But when I saw BYD, same thing. Just really good, well made vehicle.
So you think if people go out and experience BYD, so someone who's skeptical, says they're not really interested in buying a vehicle made in China, but then they see all that, you think that would push them over the edge and make the decision to buy it?
I think what helps is they're going to have to do a lot of focus groups. And I've done a lot of focus groups in the past. And what you do is you put all the spec down on a piece of paper, and it's going to be a long piece of paper. And let's say you have a bunch of competitors there. They're all debadged, and you just go in by content and price. Not price, just content. And if BYD can go down the list and achieve and excel in every category, ingress, egress, 0 to 60, range, fit and finish, if you can go down all the things that thing has for free, and you this is what you do, you say, okay, based on these 3 vehicles, which one would you choose, just based on content? And then they'll pick, let's just say hypothetically, they'll pick BYD. Then you do post price. And you go, now that you know the price of the vehicle, would you still purchase this vehicle? And a lot of people will say, well, not for that much money, I'll just buy the cheaper car. So to your point, I think the issue is going to be, it has to be priced competitively to be in the market. I think when Lexus came out, they were 30% cheaper than Mercedes-Benz, BMW at the time. And they needed to be at a price point where people could be more forgiving and say, okay, this is I'll take this leap because it's that much cheaper. For BYD, they'd have to do like a competitive ride and drive event nationally to get people in these vehicles. You can get away with, current competitors in the market by price. And loyalty can move a little bit here and there. Everybody knows BMW, Mercedes, Jaguar, Toyota, Mazda. Everybody knows those brands. If price is the issue, they'll move. But if you're an unknown brand, you either have to cut that price drastically, or you're going to have to go on a ride and drive tour across the U.S. and get people in these cars to experience the vehicle. Which is almost, now that I think about it, you look at the Porsche Center out here in California. Is there any other reason why you'd be skeptical that you'd have to go to a Porsche center to drive the vehicle to make up your mind? Probably not. But you'd have to go to those links like a BYD to build those experience centers to drive the vehicle on a track to get to know the vehicle. It's a huge investment, but if they want to be here for a long time, I think that's what you have to do. The worst part is knowing that your product's really good, but you have to discount it and know that you'll have to discount it for a while until people start recognizing the brand. The worst part is they're recognized in China. They do a very good job, but here, pretty much unknown. So that's what they're going to have to do.
Yeah. Unfortunate, but I'm sure there's going to be so much changes in the industry just in the next 5-10 years with everything going on.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question. You've driven Teslas before, right? Well, you own one. I was with a guy who runs a race team, and I went out to lunch with him, And I had never been in ludicrous mode before. Out of nowhere, he puts it into ludicrous mode. I didn't realize that your brain cannot understand what's happening. I was in the car, he launches it, and I didn't know I didn't know what was actually happening. My brain could not comprehend what was happening at the time. And it was the most surreal experience, but not an enjoyable one. So I'm not sure why it's such it's a topic. I think it was a while ago. Is ludicrous mode still one of those things that people are looking for in this car now?
I don't know. I mean, I've never experienced ludicrous mode. I think the fastest I was in was like a Model Y performance, which was still insanely fast. Or maybe a Rivian was also fast I drove. But yeah, I think insane acceleration is cool, but I mean, I don't really have an opinion on ludicrous mode because I've never experienced it. But I would imagine it's pretty fast.
Well, if you make it out to California, I'm gonna get you connected with my guy. He'll put you in that car. The other thing I didn't like was the steering wheel.
Was it the yoke?
I hate the yoke.
Yeah, that is not great.
It's something nobody wanted, and here we are. And it's all torn up on the handles.
Mm-hmm.
They palm it, and I'm like, why would you do that? It's just put a steering wheel in that car. But we'll get you out in ludicrous mode.
All right. Well, I'll be looking forward to that. And I think regardless, thank you very much, Troy, for coming on the podcast. I think we had a great conversation.
Yeah, no, it was fun. I'm surprised you're not running a car company by now. I guess you have to graduate, or you're still in school?
I am, yes.
Still in school. God, that's so surprising to me. Every time I see you on LinkedIn and you're putting out these comments and the people you're interviewing, I'm like, what are you in school for? I mean, just come over already and run a car company. I don't understand. Get it over with already, Andrew.
Well, I appreciate it.